A reputation so perfect it blinded the world. A silence so complete it broke it. And if you listen inside that silence, you'll hear the calibrations of memory. A measured inhale, held half a beat too long. The low HVAC hush mapping the room's edges. The whisper of paper settling after a printer's dry whir. A relay clicking behind a wall like a metronome that forgot the hour. Fluorescent ballast hums. A chair stills. Coats surrender their rustle. Someone tests a swallow and abandons it. Numbers sleep in obedient columns while telephones for once refuse their chorus. There is no verdict yet, only the practiced stillness of people certain they have nothing to fear. Until the quiet shapes a question you could mistake for comfort, a contour that points not to a name but to a habit, to the smallest circle drawn around a margin note. 3 letters that mean nothing to anyone who needs them to mean everything. 3 letters that will surface like a watermark when the story begins to speak. And when the room finally exhales, a voice will step in from the edge of that hush. No preface, no resume, only what was seen and what was written. A hand, a pen, a clock face catching 8:31. A packet with its neat slope of returns and a single mark circled once. And we begin there. Prologue. The morning of.
Everyone we trusted was already in. Board members with the kind of last names that open doors without knocking. The country club couple who never missed a member and never missed a quarter either. A feeder fund we envied because they were told no less often than the rest of us and wore that as a credential. It sounds gauche to admit, but inclusion did our due diligence for us. If the room was curated, we assumed the art was real. The promise was not greed so much as relief. 10 to 12%, the way a metronome promises the next beat present, modest, perfectly on time. We told ourselves we were protecting things that shouldn't have to beg for luck, scholarship lines that bridged a semester, a clinic's rent, a retirement that didn't punish careful lives. Cash-like, someone said once, and the phrase became a blanket word we tucked around anything that might get cold. You learn quickly that the most powerful pitch is not how much you could make, but how little you could worry. Our routines grew around that comfort. Mondays, we reviewed allocations. Wednesdays, we updated distributions. Fridays, we practiced being unhurried. At lunches, the language tightened into shorthand: the slope, the tranche, the roll. We traded risk stories the way ex-smokers trade cigarette lore, brave, past tense, distant from our current selves. I remember shaking hands over a banquet table centerpiece orchids and crystal when a trustee confided, almost apologetically, that he had finally gotten a ticket. I congratulated him the way you congratulate someone who got into a school you both admire and fear. By dessert, he'd added a 0 to his pledge. Status made everything glow. A gala invitation with 3 lines of sponsors felt like a notarized blessing. He's on their board. She had dinner with him once. Our auditor knows their auditor's nephew. The social graph became a wiring diagram we mistook for a circuit test. If a name lived long enough in proximity to other names, we called it vetted. The paradox of exclusivity is that it feels like scarcity and reads like proof. We wore waiting lists like lapel pins. And the numbers, they never startled. They smiled faintly, nodded, and went home at a reasonable hour. In the mid-2000s, when markets swerved like taxis, our statements floated across the month the way a well-run hotel floats a guest from lobby to room. No friction, no second thought. 10, 11, sometimes 12. Rarely 9. Never 4. You'd think that would have bothered us more than it did. But consistency is narcotic. When your calendar is packed with meetings, you can now end 10 minutes early. Incentives did the rest. The donor who sleeps well thanks you loudly. The committee that hit target renews you quietly. The young associate learns that curiosity is a virtue until it delays a wire. We didn't get bonuses for asking better questions, we got praised for making fewer calls. Risk felt like a naive hobby other people hadn't outgrown. We had moved on. Of course, we told ourselves we were prudent. We name-checked regulators like extended family they've been through there and told origin stories about people who were too public to be sloppy. We described complexity as evidence of mastery and smooth results as the harvest of that mastery. In our heads, we were defending widows' and orphans' money from the weather. In practice, we were defending an arrangement that defended us. No awkward follow-ups, no sweaty weeks, no meetings that turned into arguments about process. Every system builds a lullaby, and ours had a beautiful one. The soft whir of a printer, the page flip, the no-surprises cadence of meetings that kept ending on time. Somewhere inside that music, a different beat was waiting, but we were dancing with the partners who brought us. When I say everyone we trusted was already in, I mean that we outsourced our doubt to people whose invitations we coveted. The stakes were never just dollars. They were hospitals that had budgeted hope into their fiscal year, scholarships that existed because someone's pen had once touched approve, retirements that imagined the word enough without flinching. Looking back, I can see the foreshadowing like a watermark, how often we praised the absence of drama, how quickly we cited each other as sources, how easily it works replaced how it worked. But in that world before, the quiet felt like competence. The room was curated, the art was real, and the price of entry was the only proof we asked to see. Palm Beach had a way of turning confidence into Dacre. The season arrived with pale linens and practiced warmth, with place cards that did more than seat you, they ranked you. At the gala doors, you could read the hierarchy without moving your lips. Sponsor rows, patron rows, benefactors, a final tier reserved for names that seemed less printed than engraved into the room. Inclusion didn't whisper, it glowed. The invitation that winter was a small thesis in social proof cream card stock, serif certainty, 3 lines of imprimatur where other people parked their skepticism. Hosted by Foundation Benefactor, BLM. It might as well have said, no need to ask questions, questions have already been asked. We told ourselves this was how serious people showed their homework. The irony is that we were reading signatures as citations. It wasn't a pitch so much as a seating chart. Who you were near became what you knew. A trustee leaned in to say he'd finally met him at breakfast, and the table exhaled as if a border had been crossed on our behalf. The country club couple arrived a careful 7 minutes late, enough to be noticed but not remarked upon, and told us they were expanding with him the way people say they're adding a sunroom. In that light, prudent sounded like bigger, but still tasteful. We complimented the centerpieces and meant it. Affinity did the rest. The overlaps felt like guardrails. Same synagogue board, same cancer wing donor list, same school auction where someone's paddle didn't go down until the room ran out of numbers. If he was of our world, he must be for it. That's how affinity works. You borrow the credibility of your neighbors until you can't tell where the loan ends. We praise the community for its generosity and let the community do the underwriting. I kept the card. A handwritten introduction felt like clearance. The handwritten introduced by was our favorite kind of ink, personal, plausible, untraceable. Who wrote it and why did it matter? We never asked the first half because the second felt self-evident. Introductions were currency. The signature line was a mint. A name in that blank turned waiting list into welcome, and we pretended the origin mattered less than the access it inferred. Later, when we retraced, that blank glowed hotter than any printed line. Around dessert, the feeder fund principal told a story that landed like a benediction. We get audited, he gets examined. The table laughed at the cadence, not the meaning. A board member added, the SEC's been through there, as if those 4 words were a notarized seal. Somewhere a quartet found the bridge of a standard, and we applauded the song as if we'd earned it. What we called diligence was a choreography of assurances. A donor would say he helped the hospital through the downturn, and a CFO would nod because the hospital's gala had been air-kissed by the same guest list. The returns 10, 11, 12 were props, laid out on a velvet tray. You didn't haggle over props at a benefit, you admired them. We had built an ecosystem where the hum of mutual recognition replaced the click of verification, where seen with trumped seen by. There were tells, but they performed as compliments. The RSVP arrived early, as if we had been remembered before we remembered to ask. The benefactor line moved him from attendee to architecture. The handwritten introduction erased the distance between our desire and its authorization. If there was a question in the room, how does he actually trade? It dressed itself as a faux pas and left through the side door. We convinced ourselves that good people doing good things wouldn't stand on a floor without footing. I can still feel the cardstock flex between my fingers, the soft snap when bent, the way the emboss caught the light. Paper can be a character if you let it. When the conversation turned to year-end allocations, one more tranche, then we co-sti placed the invitation back in its envelope and wrote the date on the flap, a habit of mine when something feels decided. The orchestra swelled, a paddle went up for a neonatal unit, someone pledged the naming rights to a hallway. We were raising money for safety while telling ourselves the money was safe. If you're waiting for the first hairline crack, it wasn't a headline, it was a favor. Could you introduce us? The blank on the card asked to be filled, and we obliged because that's what we did. We filled blanks with names we trusted. Later, charities would compose statements in rooms that smelled like boxes, and invitations would feel like artifacts from a vanished season. But in the world before, the proof lived in proximity, and proximity was abundant. We didn't know it yet. But the introductions we prized had already introduced us to the edge. The first doubt didn't arrive as a speech. It arrived as an apology. Over coffee after a budget meeting, a junior trustee lowered his voice the way people do before saying something impolite and asked, almost sheepishly, "How does he actually trade?" He smiled like he was joking so he wouldn't have to defend the question if the room turned cold. I heard myself answer with furniture, blue chips, collars, out to T-bills when he sidelined. It was a description we kept on the mantel, respectable, dusted, rarely used. That afternoon, I repeated the exchange to a board member whose calm was our local weather system. He didn't look up from his email. "The SEC's been through there," he said, as if those 4 words contained footnotes and exhibits. The conversation ended itself. Relief is efficient. Micro-tensions started stacking like unread voicemails. A feeder principal bragged that his diligence wasn't cheap, which sounded less like proof than like a receipt. An allocator complained that his subscription line was closed again, then laughed as though scarcity were a compliance framework. A colleague mentioned in passing that reported option volumes looked tight on days he said he was heavy, and then softened it with, "I'm sure it nets out." We had a way of handing inconvenient facts a throw pillow. Every 30 minutes, someone offered a reason to stop thinking. "He's on that committee. They've held him for 15 years. The hospitals would know." We treated tenure like audit and proximity like policy. When a new CFO asked if we ever saw counterparty confirms, a senior waved his hand in a small circle, the gesture we used for settled topics. "Middle office sees what matters," he said. If you listened closely, you could hear the relay click topic off. The rumor came in soft, like weather from another city. Over lunch, a friend from a different shop said he'd heard a short seller was sniffing around his volumes, not with a thesis, just with a nose. "Probably jealousy," someone replied, and the table agreed because jealousy was a flaw we understood, while capacity math required a spreadsheet and a mood. The kitchen door swung, silverware sang, and the subject found its way to safer nouns: schools, schedules, flights. That week, a donor asked for a higher distribution since the safe account is so steady. I nodded, feeling the tug between what I wanted to believe and what I hadn't bothered to prove. Back at my desk, I pulled a statement and read the fine print I'd read a dozen times without reading it all. Splittstreiche. I ran a finger over the margin where I'd once written 3 letters. Habit, I told myself. The printer word page tray hush. A young analyst stopped at my doorway, energized by a podcast of all things. "They say real shops welcome questions," he said. "Half to me, half to the hallway. Maybe we should, ask a few." I smiled the way seniors smile when juniors discover gravity. "We do ask," I said, and listed our meetings like credentials. He nodded, chastened by the pile. 2 days later, I heard the same question, the impolite one more plainly. "How does he actually trade?" This time it wasn't a junior, it was a peer who counted. The room tightened. Someone used our favorite extinguisher. "He's been examined." Another added, "Everybody you respect is in." We let the names smother the spark. Here is what I know now and didn't admit then. In a world calibrated for smoothness, doubt sounds like rudeness. We protected manners over mechanics, relationships over reconciliation. The first rumor didn't sound like a threat. It was.
Chapter 1. The World Before.
Everyone we trusted was already in. Board members with the kind of last names that opened doors without knocking. The country club couple who never missed a member and never missed a quarter either. A feeder fund we envied because they were told no less often than the rest of us and wore that as a credential. It sounds gauche to admit, but inclusion did our due diligence for us. If the room was curated, we assumed the art was real. The promise was not greed so much as relief. 10 to 12%, the way a metronome promises the next beat present, modest, perfectly on time. We told ourselves we were protecting things that shouldn't have to beg for luck, scholarship lines that bridged a semester, a clinic's rent, a retirement that didn't punish careful lives. Cash-like, someone said once, and the phrase became a blanket word we tucked around anything that might get cold. You learn quickly that the most powerful pitch is not how much you could make, but how little you could worry. Our routines grew around that comfort. Mondays, we reviewed allocations. Wednesdays, we updated distributions. Fridays, we practiced being unhurried. At lunches, the language tightened into shorthand: the slope, the tranche, the roll. We traded risk stories the way ex-smokers trade cigarette lore, brave, past tense, distant from our current selves. I remember shaking hands over a banquet table, centerpiece orchids, and crystal when a trustee confided, almost apologetically, that he had finally gotten a ticket. I congratulated him the way you congratulate someone who got into a school you both admire and fear. By dessert, he'd added a 0 to his pledge. Status made everything glow. A gala invitation with 3 lines of sponsors felt like a notarized blessing. He's on their board. She had dinner with him once. Our auditor knows their auditor's nephew. The social graph became a wiring diagram we mistook for a circuit test. If a name lived long enough in proximity to other names, we called it vetted. The paradox of exclusivity is that it feels like scarcity and reads like proof. We wore waiting lists like lapel pins. And the numbers, they never startled. They smiled faintly, nodded, and went home at a reasonable hour. In the mid-2000s, when markets swerved like taxis, our statements floated across the month the way a well-run hotel floats a guest from lobby to room. No friction, no second thought. 10, 11, sometimes 12. Rarely 9. Never 4. You'd think that would have bothered us more than it did. But consistency is narcotic. When your calendar is packed with meetings, you can now end 10 minutes early. Incentives did the rest. The donor who sleeps well thanks you loudly. The committee that hit target renews you quietly. The young associate learns that curiosity is a virtue until it delays a wire. We didn't get bonuses for asking better questions. We got praised for making fewer calls. Risk felt like a naive hobby other people hadn't outgrown. We had moved on. Of course, we told ourselves we were prudent. We name-checked regulators like extended family they've been through there and told origin stories about people who were too public to be sloppy. We described complexity as evidence of mastery and smooth results as the harvest of that mastery. In our heads, we were defending widows' and orphans' money from the weather. In practice, we were defending an arrangement that defended us. No awkward follow-ups, no sweaty weeks, no meetings that turned into arguments about process. Every system builds a lullaby, and ours had a beautiful one. The soft whir of a printer, the page flip, the no-surprises cadence of meetings that kept ending on time. Somewhere inside that music, a different beat was waiting, but we were dancing with the partners who brought us. When I say everyone we trusted was already in, I mean that we outsourced our doubt to people whose invitations we coveted. The stakes were never just dollars. They were hospitals that had budgeted hope into their fiscal year, scholarships that existed because someone's pen had once touched approve, retirements that imagined the word enough without flinching. Looking back, I can see the foreshadowing like a watermark: how often we praised the absence of drama, how quickly we cited each other as sources, how easily it works replaced how it worked. But in that world before, the quiet felt like competence. The room was curated, the art was real, and the price of entry was the only proof we asked to see. Palm Beach had a way of turning confidence into Dacre. The season arrived with pale linens and practiced warmth, with place cards that did more than seat you, they ranked you. At the gala doors, you could read the hierarchy without moving your lips. Sponsor rows, patron rows, benefactors, a final tier reserved for names that seemed less printed than engraved into the room. Inclusion didn't whisper, it glowed. The invitation that winter was a small thesis in social proof cream card stock. Serif Certainty, 3 lines of imprimatur where other people parked their skepticism. Hosted by Foundation Benefactor, BLM. It might as well have said, no need to ask questions, questions have already been asked. We told ourselves this was how serious people showed their homework. The irony is that we were reading signatures as citations. It wasn't a pitch so much as a seating chart. Who you were near became what you knew. A trustee leaned in to say he'd finally met him at breakfast, and the table exhaled as if a border had been crossed on our behalf. The country club couple arrived a careful 7 minutes late, enough to be noticed but not remarked upon, and told us they were expanding with him the way people say they're adding a sunroom. In that light, prudent sounded like bigger, but still tasteful. We complimented the centerpieces and meant it. Affinity did the rest. The overlaps felt like guardrails. Same synagogue board, same cancer wing donor list, same school auction where someone's paddle didn't go down until the room ran out of numbers. If he was of our world, he must be for it. That's how affinity works. You borrow the credibility of your neighbors until you can't tell where the loan ends. We praise the community for its generosity and let the community do the underwriting. I kept the card. A handwritten introduction felt like clearance. The handwritten introduced by was our favorite kind of ink, personal, plausible, untraceable. Who wrote it and why did it matter? We never asked the first half because the second felt self-evident. Introductions were currency. The signature line was a mint. A name in that blank turned waiting list into welcome, and we pretended the origin mattered less than the access it inferred. Later, when we retraced, that blank glowed hotter than any printed line. Around dessert, the feeder fund principal told a story that landed like a benediction. We get audited, he gets examined. The table laughed at the cadence, not the meaning. A board member added, the SEC's been through there, as if those 4 words were a notarized seal. Somewhere a quartet found the bridge of a standard, and we applauded the song as if we'd earned it. What we called diligence was a choreography of assurances. A donor would say he helped the hospital through the downturn, and a CFO would nod because the hospital's gala had been air-kissed by the same guest list. The returns 10, 11, 12 were props, laid out on a velvet tray. You didn't haggle over props at a benefit, you admired them. We had built an ecosystem where the hum of mutual recognition replaced the click of verification, where seen with trumped seen by. There were tells, but they performed as compliments. The RSVP arrived early, as if we had been remembered before we remembered to ask. The benefactor line moved him from attendee to architecture. The handwritten introduction erased the distance between our desire and its authorization. If there was a question in the room, how does he actually trade? It dressed itself as a faux pas and left through the side door. We convinced ourselves that good people doing good things wouldn't stand on a floor without footing. I can still feel the cardstock flex between my fingers, the soft snap when bent, the way the emboss caught the light. Paper can be a character if you let it. When the conversation turned to year-end allocations, one more tranche, then we I placed the invitation back in its envelope and wrote the date on the flap, a habit of mine when something feels decided. The orchestra swelled. A paddle went up for a neonatal unit. Someone pledged the naming rights to a hallway. We were raising money for safety while telling ourselves the money was safe. If you're waiting for the first hairline crack, it wasn't a headline, it was a favor. Could you introduce us? The blank on the card asked to be filled, and we obliged because that's what we did. We filled blanks with names we trusted. Later, charities would compose statements in rooms that smelled like boxes, and invitations would feel like artifacts from a vanished season. But in the world before, the proof lived in proximity, and proximity was abundant. We didn't know it yet. But the introductions we prized had already introduced us to the edge. The first doubt didn't arrive as a speech. It arrived as an apology. Over coffee after a budget meeting, a junior trustee lowered his voice the way people do before saying something impolite and asked, almost sheepishly, how does he actually trade? He smiled like he was joking so he wouldn't have to defend the question if the room turned cold. I heard myself answer with furniture, blue chips, collars, out to T-bills when he sidelined. It was a description we kept on the mantle, respectable, dusted, rarely used. That afternoon, I repeated the exchange to a board member whose calm was our local weather system. He didn't look up from his email. The SEC's been through there, he said, as if those 4 words contained footnotes and exhibits. The conversation ended itself. Relief is efficient. Microtensions started stacking like unread voicemails. A feeder principal bragged that his diligence wasn't cheap, which sounded less like proof than like a receipt. An allocator complained that his subscription line was closed again, then laughed as though scarcity were a compliance framework. A colleague mentioned in passing that reported option volumes looked tight on days he said he was heavy, and then softened it with, "I'm sure it nets out." We had a way of handing inconvenient facts a throw pillow. Every 30 minutes, someone offered a reason to stop thinking. He's on that committee. They've held him for 15 years. The hospitals would know. We treated tenure like audit and proximity like policy. When a new CFO asked if we ever saw counterparty confirms, a senior waved his hand in a small circle, the gesture we used for settled topics. "Middle office sees what matters," he said. If you listened closely, you could hear the relay click topic off. The rumor came in soft, like weather from another city. Over lunch, a friend from a different shop said he'd heard a short seller was sniffing around his volumes, not with a thesis, just with a nose. "Probably jealousy," someone replied, and the table agreed because jealousy was a flaw we understood, while capacity math required a spreadsheet and a mood. The kitchen door swung, silverware sang, and the subject found its way to safer noun schools, schedules, flights. That week a donor asked for a higher distribution since the safe account is so steady. I nodded, feeling the tug between what I wanted to believe and what I hadn't bothered to prove. Back at my desk, I pulled a statement and read the fine print I'd read a dozen times without reading it all. Splittstrike. I ran a finger over the margin where I'd once written 3 letters. Habit, I told myself. The printer word page tray hush. A young analyst stopped at my doorway, energized by a podcast of all things. "They say real shops welcome questions," he said. "Half to me, half to the hallway. Maybe we should, ask a few." I smiled the way seniors smile when juniors discover gravity. "We do ask," I said, and listed our meetings like credentials. He nodded, chastened by the pile. 2 days later, I heard the same question, the impolite one more plainly. How does he actually trade? This time it wasn't a junior, it was a peer who counted. The room tightened. Someone used our favorite extinguisher. "He's been examined." Another added, "Everybody you respect is in." We let the name smother the spark. Here is what I know now and didn't admit then. In a world calibrated for smoothness, doubt sounds like rudeness. We protected manners over mechanics, relationships over reconciliation. The first rumor didn't sound like a threat. It was.
Chapter 2. How it worked.
I tried to explain it the way it had been explained to me, the way I'd repeated it so often it had hardened into furniture. "Split strike conversion," I said, sketching a rectangle on a legal pad as if the shape could hold the certainty. "Start with a basket of large cap, boring on purpose names blue chips you'd happily own through a storm. On top of that, sell calls to earn premium, buy protective puts to cap the fall. When the model says the market's hostile, you step out, move to T-Bills Park until the weather clears." I could hear the comfort in my own voice, like a tour guide who knows where the guardrails are. Across the table, a colleague, sharp, kind, allergic to mystique, watched the box I'd drawn as if it might blink. "So it's a collar," she said, with timing. Her eyebrow hung there a second longer than politeness requires, the human version of a relay click. "Prudent, proprietary, boring," I offered, half-joke, whole truth of how it sounded to us. Boring was the feature. Boring promised we could budget the year without inventing a weather report. I labeled the sides of the sketch like a school problem. Equity basket, short calls, long puts, T-bills went out. "The puts cost you," I said, tapping the corner, "but they buy you sleep. The calls give you a stipend. Net it. And if you're good at the timing, if you don't overstay, you get a steady slope. 10, 11, 12, if the wind helps." I heard myself, and I heard the words we had all learned to love. Steady, slope, sleep. She pointed at the unlabeled center of my box. "What's that?" "That," I said, "is the signal." "Whose?" I let the air sit a beat, long enough to hear the room HVAC hush, a distant printer's dry whir, somewhere a page settling after a flip. "His," I said, and winced at how much the pronoun carried. "He's known for this year's of it. There's a model, discipline. When he's out cash-like. T-bills." The phrase felt like placing a warm towel over a cold fact. She didn't argue, she organized. Okay, she said, ticking with her pen. Basket composition, who chooses? Option strikes, how far out of the money? How often do you roll? And this out of the market, what triggers it? Drawdown percentile? Realized vol band? News? Gut? Signals, I said, as if plurality could do the lifting. He's never theatrical about it. No heroics. That's the point. Boring, she repeated, not unkindly. Perfect. We sat with the diagram between us like a placemat. In my pocket, my phone buzzed with a compliance reminder in 15 minutes. Wires would cue. The word routine glowed on the screen. I set it face down. Look, I said, we've watched this for a decade. In when it's safe, out when it's not. Calls pay you to wait, puts pay you not to panic. You don't need to win big, you need to not lose ugly. I could hear the pitch tightening into aphorism, the linguistic cousin of returns that never startled. She nodded at the outline. It's a story that wants to be true, she said. Insurance plus income plus a thermostat. Then, the eyebrow again. Stories like that usually cost you somewhere. Where does this one cost you? In access, I said too quickly. You don't just walk in. And in humility, you don't second-guess the thermostat. Process, she said, almost to herself, and boxed the word in my margin. Who sets it? Who checks it? Who can override it? I felt the old comfort reach for me, names, committees, examinations, that long, soothing sentence about being through there. Instead, I tapped the legal pad and tried to answer like an adult. Baskets blue chips lowest drama components. Strikes get tuned to harvest premium without inviting assignment. Rolls are scheduled, not improvised. Out-of-market moves go to short-dated treasuries. The point is to be uninteresting on purpose. And when she's out, my colleague said, touching the center of the box again, who says so? The model, I said. Whose model? Silence not hostile, just honest set down between us. In the hallway, a printer exhaled another page, that soft mechanical assent that papers over questions. I drew a small circle in the corner of the pad around 3 letters I'd already written that week, a private fence around a thought I wasn't ready to have. He does, I said at last. He says when we're out. The eyebrow stayed. The box stayed. The story held for the moment because boring still felt like proof. She let my box and arrows sit a moment longer and then, as if asking for cream with her coffee, said the sentence that lifted the rug. Show me the fills. No edge, no challenge, just a simple request for the receipts of a story that wanted to be true. The room didn't change temperature, but I felt the air notice itself. Somewhere in the hall, the printer gave its dry whir, a page slid, the soft assent of paper agreeing with whoever touched it last. Of course, I said, because that is what you say when the obvious is asked. Fills are the grammar of trading. Timestamps, quantities, strikes, counterparties, the who and when of money moving. I flipped my packet page flip, expecting the choreography to reveal its steps. Trade blotter, option tickets, the tidy math that reconciles a sentence with a ledger. What I found was the same slope, the same fine print, the same permission to stop looking. I tapped the header where the strategy lived in lowercase split strike conversion, and my pen drifted to the margin, where, days earlier, I had circled 3 letters. SSC? It hadn't been a flourish, it was a fence I'd put around a question I'd been pretending was a habit. Pull the tickets, she said pleasantly. Just let me see the day he was heavy in calls. The month the puts saved us. Where did they print? Which floor? Who crossed? I heard myself offer substitutes. He's very private about mechanics. We see statements monthly, the auditors, and then I stopped. Because even I could hear the furniture creak. She waited. Good colleagues know that silence is an instrument. It tunes people. That night I opened a different window. Not an accusation, just arithmetic. Reported option volumes on the days our statements bragged about prudence open interest that looked too slender to seat the size implied by our confidence. The listed market had a capacity, the way a stadium has seats. Our tickets, if they existed as described, needed sections that weren't there. Maybe it was OTC, I told myself, privately negotiated, quietly sized. But OTC still leaves footprints, a counterparty's shadow, a broker's echo. My inbox had praise and distributions, it did not have echoes. I scrolled back to the artifact I'd already lived with. The cropped statement header, the lowercase comfort, the margin note circled once. In the quiet of my kitchen, those letters stopped behaving like initials and started behaving like a flare. SSC wasn't a doodle, it was the first time my hand had admitted what my voice refused to try. I couldn't square the story with the street. The next morning I asked for what any grown-up should ask for. Could we get some fills? I wrote casual as Friday. Representative tickets are fine. The reply came quick, warm, dismissive in the way efficiency can be. Statements reflect executions he's out of the market, often hard to capture. The printer in our office breathed again, as if to say the day had been handled. Page flip. Routine. I went back to my sketch basket. Calls, puts, T-bills, and put a small dot in the center where I'd written signal. Whose? She'd asked me. His, I'd said, and the pronoun had carried belief like a palanquin. Now the dot felt heavier than the box that contained it. If the fills were the grammar, our story was conjugating in the passive voice. Trades were said to have been done. Risk was said to have been managed. We were said to be out. Here is where the slope of my certainty changed by a degree you wouldn't notice on a chart. I still liked the neatness, the prudence, the boring. I still loved the hum that let meetings end on time. But when the printer whirred that afternoon, the sound no longer felt like agreement, it felt like camouflage. For the first time, the numbers that kept us calm asked for something back, proof. And in the space where proof should live, I found my own handwriting, 3 letters under a small, unambiguous circle, staring up as if to say, ask again.
Chapter 3. Rising Action.
The strange thing about doubt is how quickly it gets drowned out by demand. The week after I asked for fills, the switchboard behaved like a harvest lights climbing, blinking, settling while my inbox learned new ways to say yes. Donors added zeros the way people add exclamation marks to a story they love telling. You've taken such good care of us, one wrote, as if we'd shepherded the market personally. Another wanted to lean in before year-end. A third asked if we could top off a foundation he treated like a favorite room in a favorite house. The printer kept paste dry whir, page, hush as if the day were printing its own applause. Somebody turned a joke into deck copy. We get audited, he gets examined. The line traveled like a passport stamp. I saw it in a feeder fund's 1-pager, then on the lip of a podium where a principal practiced certainty into a microphone. Audited. Examined. You could feel the words doing the work we didn't want to do. They were legalese as lullaby. We repeated them because the room nodded when we did. Money, once labeled buffer, started behaving like budget. Grants were accelerated because the safe account was steady. A hospital brought forward a renovation, saying the returns could shoulder the first swing of demolition. A scholarship program doubled a cohort and promised the next class site unseen. We'd meant the account to catch us if we slipped. Now we were leaning on it to walk faster. That's when a buffer becomes a crutch. Not when you touch it, but when your gait rearranges around it. The micro wins sold the macro risk. A colleague paid for a long postponed vacation out of the slope just this once. A trustee covered a child's wedding deposit with a confidence that sounded like whether it'll refill. A small nonprofit retimed payroll to match our distribution cadence and sent a thank you basket that smelled like citrus and relief. None of it wicked or wild, all of it quietly compounding. Efficiency is persuasive when it pays for joy. Phones trained us to hear confidence as evidence. A donor's assistant would call with a tone that assumed we were already aligned. We're adding 2, maybe 3. Do you have capacity? Capacity? The word made us feel like air traffic controllers of a sky we hadn't measured. We can accommodate, I said, and felt the sentence fit like a uniform. In the corner of my blotter, a legal pad held the box I'd drawn, basket, calls, puts, T-bills, underlining signal in a hand that looked more tentative than mine. I kept asking in the polite ways to see examples. A representative ticket, a day where the puts paid for the panic. Replies were warm, crisp, unhelpful. He's often out of the market, hard to capture, one wrote, inviting me to accept absence as prudence. Another sent a statement with the same elegant slope and the same lowercase comfort, split strike conversion like a brand promise on a bottle you don't open. The printer agreed. Page flip. Hush. Meanwhile, reputations did what reputations do. They multiplied. X is in, someone said, naming a name that acted like a key in 3 zip codes. Y got increased, said someone else. with the air of a person reporting good weather. A board member relayed that a regulator had been through there, compressing years of oversight mythology into 4 words that could end a meeting early. I watched our calendars rearrange themselves around the assumption that smoothness was a feature, not a warning. We started budgeting on a slope that never startled. If the tranche posts by the 15th, we'll release the clinic funds on the 20th. If the distribution lands Friday, let's book the equipment install Monday. The conditional tense became muscle memory, and my pen annoyingly honest drew a smaller circle around 3 letters I'd already circled once. In the glow of momentum, doubt felt impolite. When the switchboard lights rose in unison mid-afternoon, the room applauded without clapping. Approving wires, revising targets, scheduling updates that assumed the next page would look like this one. We told ourselves we were stewards. We told ourselves we were efficient. We told ourselves the community had pre-cleared what curiosity might only complicate. But every time a donor added a 0, the leverage on our belief ticked up another notch. The phones were a chorus, and the song was pleasant, and somewhere under it a relay kept clicking, steady as a metronome, asking without insisting whether we were hearing rhythm or warning. The clue didn't arrive as a siren, it came as stationary. In a light-touch diligence folder, our phrase, "Not theirs," I found an audit letter that looked like it wanted to be bigger than it was. The logo tried for gravitas, but the font gave away its diet. The address put it between a nail salon and a tax prep place 2 doors down from a laundromat. 3 partners listed, 2 phone lines. No floor number because there were no floors. It wasn't wrong exactly. It was small. We had spent so long equating size with fussiness that small read as charming, then as thrifty, then as a kind of folk wisdom that didn't bother the bigger firms because it didn't need to. "He's loyal," someone said, which is the kind of story you tell when the facts don't volunteer one themselves. We were prepping for a donor who liked to flip to the back of any binder and land hard on controls. The binder had tabs A through F, then an appendix no one opened unless someone asked the kind of question that rearranged the rest of your day. I could hear the office practicing its calm, printers whirring, pages settling, the relay behind the wall clicking its untroubled tempo. A colleague joked that the examiners liked him because he didn't waste their time. We all laughed at the efficiency of it. I set the audit letter next to our diligence checklist A template that had been copied so often the boxes were ghosts of boxes, and let my pen travel the line items like rosary beads. Custody, reconciliation, counterparty confirms. There was a faint indentation where someone had once pressed too hard on a previous version, then a darker truth on this one. DTCC confirm? Scratched out with a single deliberate stroke. No comment balloon, no revision history, just absence doing its work. I touched the paper and felt heat where there should have been handwriting. Audit letterhead from a 3-person strip mall firm beside it. A diligence checklist with DTCC confirm struck through once. By whom? Mystery has a way of turning every sound into a question. The HVAC hush became an alibi. The printer's breath suggested it had already printed whatever answer we were supposed to accept. I asked around in the polite register you use when you don't want to demonstrate ignorance who usually handles the street-side confirmations. Middle office came one answer, vague enough to end 4 more questions. Another said, "Auditors see what matters," which is a sentence that does a lot of lifting for a lot of people. When I pressed lightly, a senior waved his hand in a circle over the checklist, the gesture we used for done. The relay clicked. Topic off. In the weeks prior, we had let "we get audited, he gets examined" stand in for an argument. Now the letterhead sat there, small and specific, and the examination felt like a room whose door we admired but never opened. I turned the page, hoping for the grown-up comfort of third-party initials, names of counterparties, reference numbers you could point to from 2 directions. Instead, I found precisely arranged generalities and a vocabulary that preferred the passive voice. Is reviewed, is confirmed, is reconciled. By whom? My pen wanted to write again. By what? It's tempting to call this a red flag. It wasn't red, it was beige, the color of paperwork that always files on time. We told ourselves stories that made the beige noble. He remembers where he started. He supports the little guys. He's too visible to cut corners. We let loyalty decorate what verification should have furnished. The checklist's scratched line kept lighting in my peripheral vision, as if the paper itself were wincing. I asked once more, lower now, as if whispering would make the question more admissible. Do we ever confirm with the street? The answer was a smile designed to end a meeting. He's often out of the market. There's not much to confirm. The printer exhaled a page. The room practiced being finished. And under the neat slope of returns, under the music of smoothness, a small crossed-out question refused to stop humming. The next time I raised it, I did it gently. Do we ever confirm with the street? And a board member I'd learned to borrow calm from didn't even look up. The SEC's been through there, he said, a period disguised as reassurance. The sentence did what it always did. It replaced particulars with presence, process with proximity. But I'd just set the strip mall letterhead beside our checklist and stared at the single line that should have moored the whole story. DTCC confirm, struck through once, neat as an erasure you're meant to admire. Here is what that scratch meant in practice. No request to the clearinghouse that actually sees trades. No blue sheet echoes. No counterparty initials that let two sides of a ledger point at the same moment and agree it happened. It meant the numbers on our page spoke only to themselves, statements, certifying statements, while the street, which keeps indifferent memory, was never asked to remember us. We had receipts that were summary and summaries that were receipts. The story looped, elegantly, inside our walls. Outside, silence. I tried to dress the gap in language we all liked. He's often out of the market, I was told again, as if absence were a form of prudence that excused the lack of footprints. But out should still leave a trail. Treasury purchases settle somewhere, collateral lives somewhere, wires cross a map. No DTCC, no counterparties checked meant no one who didn't love the story had been invited to verify it. The relay behind the wall clicked, topic off. The printer offered its dry amen. Page, tray, hush. And yet, at the same moment, my questions were learning to stand. Demand was learning to sprint. Allocators who'd been waiting called with the tone of people finally seated at a full restaurant. We heard capacity freed up. Can we get one more tranche before year-end? A foundation moved a capital call forward since the safe account is so reliable. A trustee texted, "We're topping up." And the phrase felt less like a decision than a weather report. Phones lit, blinked, steadied, rose again, the pattern that makes a room feel successful and a skeptic feel impolite. I kept saying, softly, "Counterparty?" And the room kept answering, loudly, "Momentum." A donor's assistant asked if we could expedite documents because the hospital wants to break ground. A peer slid a finger down a statement and said, "Not unkindly, this is the cleanest paper I've ever seen." Clean is a cunning word. It can mean reconciled or untested. We preferred the first meaning because it ended meetings on time. By the week's end, our calendar had shifted half a step forward to accommodate the future we were already spending. Remittances were scheduled against dates the slope had trained us to trust. Wire templates multiplied like photocopies. In the corner of my legal pad, the box I'd drawn basket, calls, puts, T-bills held a heavier center of gravity, the dot-labeled signal tugging the page down. The checklist's erasure glowed in the corner of my vision. The SEC's been through there floated through the air like incense, pleasant, unmeasurable, gone. Then the switchboard rose in unison, afternoon lights climbing as if to cue applause, and someone called across the floor, "Last window before the holiday, who's got room?" We did, apparently. We always did. The relay clicked. The printer breathed. The room arranged itself around yes, and the tempo nudged from brisk to urgent, the kind of quickening you don't name because you like how it feels. Peak was no longer a slope on paper, it was entering the building.
Chapter 4. Peak.
The pattern announced itself on the phones before it appeared on paper. 10 past the hour brought the first scout calls, polite inquiries dressed as courtesies. At 20, the assistants checked calendars. At 35, the principals found a spare room, and by 50, you could feel the floor leaning forward, waiting for the next green light to blink. The switchboard looked like choreography. Climb, hold, settle, climb, hold, settle. In the background, the printer kept time. Dry whir, page, hush, and the relay behind the wall ratified our momentum with its metronome click. The statements would come later, gliding up the way they always did, but the music of the day was already singing the month. "Can we get one more tranche before year-end?" became the house refrain. It floated from doorways and subject lines, a seasonal carol with a tempo that never sped up because it didn't need to. One more tranche at 9:15 from a donor who'd just toured a wing named for someone we admired. One more tranche at 10. 40 from a family office that treated the account like a sweep, a place where idle cash learned manners. One more tranche at 105 from a trustee who'd moved payroll to match our cadence because why wouldn't you when the slope never scolded? Each request wore prudence like a blazer. We didn't hear appetite, we heard scheduling. Around us, markets did what markets do, dart, faint, wobble, yet our pages floated across the month without catching a draft. Colleagues started speaking of the account as if it were a utility. Flip the switch, the light comes on. A project manager, weary from a year of underfunded fixes, called it our high-yield checking. A CFO, careful by religion, shifted reserves there with the calm of someone moving sweaters from one drawer to another. "It's cash-like," she said, and the phrase "our favorite blanket" tucked itself around the room. The small comforts multiplied. A board chair forwarded a note from her banker, "Jealous of your consistency." A program lead greenlit an expansion because the slope can absorb a bump. Someone joked that the account had become our Switzerland neutral, serene, forever available, then asked if we could wire by Friday. We did. The printer approved. Page flip. Hush. What I remember most is the texture of relief. Meetings ended early because there was nothing to debate. We stopped hedging our verbs. If the distribution lands softened into when it lands, then into it lands. The calendar inhaled certainty and exhaled plans. Groundbreaking dates inked, scholarship cohorts doubled, invoices pulled forward because why wait when the staircase ahead of you is so even you forget it has steps. We told ourselves that boring was the dividend of discipline. We told each other we had earned this ease. And yet seed small as a pin the tail kept pricking. Not the shape of the line, but its refusal to reflect the weather. On days when headlines shouted, our slope cleared its throat and resumed its inside voice. On months when other charts looked like seismographs, ours looked like a ruler. We praised it as professionalism, as insulation, as proof that prudence ages well. In the margin of one packet, my pen hovered over those 3 letters again without touching down. Habit, I nearly wrote, but habit was the point. By late afternoon, the phone pattern returned for its encore. Lights rose in unison, the room leaned in, someone called across the floor, "We can fit 2 more before close. Who's got names?" A chorus answered, "Vido, Vido." The relay clicked its assent. The printer breathed. One more tranche before year-end, floated once more, perfectly timed, perfectly reasonable. The statements would arrive on schedule, their slope unbothered, their fine print obedient. We smiled at the smoothness because smoothness was the song, and if there was a note out of key, it hid in the part we'd come to love most. How little the music ever changed. Here is what all that smoothness meant when you stripped the music out of it. No one outside the inner circle had ever seen a real fill. On a live trade, there's a trail so ordinary you stop noticing it, an order ticket with a counterparty code, the little alphabet that tells you who took the other side, a timestamp that lands in the same minute on 2 different ledgers, a clearing number that lets a stranger at a terminal confirm you existed on the tape. Our packets had slope and summary, but they did not have that grammar. The place where a counterparty should have been named was as blank as a polite smile. The page still looked clean. Clean can mean reconciled. It can also mean untouched. Remember the strip mall letterhead and the checklist with DTCC confirm? Scratched out once, neat as an erasure you're meant to admire? That wasn't a curiosity, it was the hinge. If you don't ask the clearinghouse that keeps indifferent memory whether your trades ever lived there, the only evidence you possess is paper that talks to itself. The street never had to remember us because we never required it to. Our wins were entirely domestic generated, printed and approved inside rooms that loved the story. Outside those rooms, silence. Said plainly. Had a regulator called DTCC, they'd have reached an answering machine with our name missing. Had an auditor worth the word walked across the street and asked a counterparty to pull a ticket, they'd have come back with empty hands and a look that rearranges your month. Instead, we accepted statements as surrogates for executions. We let an examination stand in for a phone call. We called absence out of the market and treated that phrase like an alibi. It is amazing how long an organization can live on paperwork calories. Every number that soothed a donor's heartbeat, every tranche that arrived exactly when it was supposed to, every quarter that looked like a ruler, each was a document, not a trade. We didn't celebrate market discipline, we celebrated mail merge. The printer gave us applause, dry whir, page, hush, and we mistook that sound for truth clearing its throat. Page flip, relay click, approved. Even the gaps had been curated to flatter us. He's often out of the market, we were told, as if prudence explained why the street never knew our name. But out is not a synonym for invisible. Cash parks somewhere. Collateral lives somewhere. Treasury purchases leave footprints in places that have no reason to lie for you. When no one who doesn't love you can verify you, you aren't safe, you're staged. I wish I could tell you the realization arrived like a siren. It didn't. It arrived like déjà vu. The phones lifted into their late-day pattern. The room leaned toward one more year-end tranche. The printer breathed, and in that ordinary chorus, I finally heard the missing part, the counterparty code that never appeared, the third-party echo that never answered back, the strip mall letter that had been auditioning for credibility it could not carry. The pattern wasn't the slope, it was the refusal to register weather, the refusal to register anywhere beyond our walls. I recognized the pattern too late.
Chapter 5. How it fails.
The math didn't change, the weather did. In the fall of 2008, inflows turned off like someone had found the master switch, and redemptions came on with the stubborn mechanical certainty of a sump pump. The first calls were courteous, just a little liquidity. To be safe then, urgent, we need it by Friday then, shameless in the way panic debates no etiquette at all. Requests stacked until they weren't requests anymore, they were instructions written in caps. Wire out. The number swelled past what we called normal risk management, then past what we privately called a stress test, then past the balance in the drawer. 7 billion asked to leave. Hundreds of millions actually lived within reach. If you've never felt the difference between those two sentences in your hands, picture trying to pull a parade through a keyhole. Our screens showed the loop in real time. Calls for cash begat fear, fear begat withdrawals, withdrawals begat more calls for cash. A relay clicked behind the wall, idiotically steady. The printer word, still capable of producing statements as if paper were a solvent for need. Page, tray, hush. But there were no trades to unwind, because there had been no trades, there was only the choreography we'd mistaken for proof. We're out of the market. The line that once wrapped us like wool returned as a splinter. Out meant nothing to sell, nothing to settle, nothing to settle, nothing to throw into the street to raise the difference between what the world wanted back and what our accounts could deliver. The phones learned a new pattern, bursting, gasping, holding donors who'd called for allocations now calling for lifeboats. A hospital that had scheduled a groundbreaking asked if we could temporarily reverse last month's draw. A scholarship director, voice thinning at the edges, wondered if tuition wires could be rerouted just for this term. We told ourselves this was market contagion, that everyone was hoarding liquidity, that our steadiness would be valued in the end. But steadiness is expensive when you owe cash you can't create. Inside our packet binders, the slope still held its calm, but outside the building the bid for money had changed species, it had teeth. I opened a statement and felt ridiculous. What else do you call the act of reading a month's serenity while a line of people asks for exits? The checklist I'd studied, the one with DTCC confirm, struck through, stared back like a bad joke only I could hear. If there had been tickets, there would have been positions to flatten, calls to buy back, puts to sell, baskets to liquidate into whatever bid was left. Instead, our toolset was clerical. Emails, transfers, reassurances, salted with timelines we no longer owned. Every time I said processing, I could feel the word lose weight. The machine didn't seize because the parts were defective, it seized because the parts were imaginary. Liquidity is a bridge you build before you need to cross it. We had built a photograph of a bridge and framed it well. The market changed the light, the picture stayed a picture. It would be merciful to blame only the storm, but collapse is always a chain of choices. Someone chose an auditor no real multi-billion shop would choose small enough to be loyal, quiet enough to be convenient, insufficient by design. Someone else decided that examined could stand in for audited, that a walkthrough of procedures was the same as a reconciliation of trades. We repeated the line because it spared us the work. We get audited, he gets examined. Meanwhile, the place where markets keep indifferent memory, the clearinghouse, the counterparties, was never asked to remember us. No DTCC pings, no blue sheet echoes, no tickets you could lay next to a statement and watch the times rhyme. Why would the inner circle select a strip mall letterhead to vouch for a skyscraper of money? Because scale invites questions and smallness can be shaped. Because backdating requires a room that will not be surprised. Because a budget firm offers what prestige firms cannot. The plausible deniability of "we're not built for that" every time a test might graze the truth. Why didn't regulators insist on street-side verification? Deference. Mostly his stature did the talking before anyone asked a question, and inexperience, the kind that confuses well-kept files with independent facts. The guardrails were lifted by politeness. Examiners who admired the resume, intermediaries who preferred reputation to reference numbers, our own committees, grateful for smoothness, who let a practiced calm pass as policy. And us? We crossed the line in pencil, calling absence prudence and scarcity proof. We liked how out of the market felt in the mouth, sober, mature without asking where the cash parked, who held the collateral, which broker would wave back if we shouted our account number across the street. We let a thin vocabulary slope, tranche, roll do thick work. We treated the auditor's signature as a bridge and never checked whether it reached the other side. When the redemptions hit, you could trace the failure like a schematic. Requests surge, right arrow; statements reassure, right arrow; examiners review procedures, right arrow; no one pulls a ticket, right arrow; the street stays silent, right arrow; the printer keeps breathing. Page, tray, hush. The machine that should have said no had been taught to say later, and later is how systems fail. Who crossed the line and why? Because smallness made secrecy cheap, because stature made scrutiny feel rude, because our incentives paid out in quiet days and quick approvals. The better question is the one our process never forced. Who, precisely, verifies the verifier? I put it at the top of a clean page, underlined it once, and stared at the blank that followed, the kind of silence that isn't comfort but instruction. The next step wasn't belief or biography. It was a call. To whom and in what order? That's where this turns.
Chapter 6. Edge of the turn.
The day started with someone else's panic and ended with mine wearing a better suit. At 8:07, my mentee stood in the doorway holding two phones like lit matches. "Clients want out now," she said. No preamble, no euphemism, the word now landing with the authority of a signature. She was good disciplined, allergic to drama, and even she'd begun skipping the softeners. I told her to triage. Oldest money first, smallest balances fastest, anything labeled operating to the top of the stack. She nodded, brave and 29, and left a crescent of fingerprints on the glass of my door. By 8:43, the margin clerk from a separate book was pinging me like a metronome that had discovered anxiety. That account, my ordinary, imperfect, non-mythic portfolio, had breathed the same air as everyone else's that month, which meant collateral had shrunk while the floor kept rising. "We need 5 by close," he said at first, then 3 by lunch, then anything now. His voice had the patient, practiced neutrality that lives one floor below alarm. I looked at the spreadsheet, saw the numbers that belonged to whether not betrayal, and hated how interchangeable the two felt inside the same hour. At 9:20, my spouse texted from a school parking lot. "Tuition due this week. Can the safe fund cover the spring?" The phrase arrived like a photograph of our best intentions. We'd never used it that way, not directly, but we'd used it to decide everything that made used it unnecessary. Camps booked in advance, a leak repaired without debate, the luxury of not refreshing an account balance before saying yes to a child who had learned to ask small. I typed back, of course, then deleted the words and stared at the blinking cursor as if it were counting something other than seconds. Phones performed their new choreography. Ring, hold, voicemail, ring again. "Not a run," someone said, "just prudence." And I heard the sentence, "try to move furniture." The mentee reappeared with a list she'd made in a hurry and in neat handwriting, as if clarity might make order. "They're afraid of everything," she said. "But they trust us." I didn't correct the pronoun. I didn't deserve it, and I needed it. By 10:06, the printer offered its dry liturgy whir, page, hush, delivering statements whose calm looked obscene next to the requests they could not satisfy. The relay behind the wall clicked its idiotically steady tempo. My inbox held 3 flavors of insistence: donors who wanted exits, colleagues who wanted comfort, and vendors who believed the calendar more than the weather. The margin clerk called once more, voice tight now. "We'll need wires or positions," he said. "Positions." A simple noun that belonged to a world with counters and tickets and names that could wave back. I moved through the room like a person rescuing files from a leak, everything damp, nothing yet ruined, the worst happening quietly. The mentee asked if she should remind them about the examination, and I heard myself say, "Remind them we're processing," a sentence that means less every time it's used. I opened my desk drawer and found the envelope where we kept emergency comforts checklists, phrases that had worked on other days. The one on top read cash-like in a font that suddenly felt unserious. At 11:32, my spouse wrote again, "Do I cue the payment or wait?" I typed, "Wait a day," then added, "just to be safe," and felt the words tilt the room. The safe fund was supposed to interrupt fear, now it required it. I set my phone down, palms flat on the desk the way people do when they've run out of polite verbs. The printer breathed. The relay clicked. Somewhere down the hall, the mentees laughed tired and still game broke for an instant and reassembled. Character is who you are when the room stops offering you cover. I wasn't heroic. I was inventorying people, balances, excuses that sounded like policy. I told myself we had hours. Then I told myself hours were enough. Then I listened to the phones explain where belief goes when it needs cash and realized the only thing I could promise, without lying, was that I'd keep answering. The hour turned granular 5-minute blocks spent in verbs that refused to conjugate. I dialed the auditor and heard the particular optimism of a ringing line I typed to the feeder and watched the cursor wait for its own authority. I refreshed the regulator's site until the page felt like a loop. The printer issued its dry "amen were" page hush as if statements could be ballast. I flipped one over just to change the sound, page flip. The relay behind the wall kept its idiotically brave tempo, click, click, as if time itself were a policy. I started leaving myself breadcrumbs, times, calls, what I'd asked, what I'd promised. The day needed to see its own handwriting. 3 lines, no answers. I tried again. The auditor's receptionist recommitted me to later with the cheer of a well-trained gate. The feeder texted a question that was really a plea, "Anything clearing today?" And I typed processing because it fit in a bubble. The mentee hovered at the doorway with a stack of folders that had learned to be an apology. "Do you want me to start calling the long-timers?" she asked. I nodded because character meant trying, and trying had hours left to spend. The margin clerk pinged, "Confirm wiring path." Path, another word that presumes a place on the other end. I wrote it down so it wouldn't feel rhetorical. The room performed competence. Printer, were. Page, tray, hush. Page flip. Relay click. We answered phones with the intonation of solvency. I added 2 more lines to the log. 11:13 follow-up W/auditor. 11:37 escalated feeder ask and looked at the sentences as if they might alchemize into money. They did not. I opened a statement and hated its poise. It had the neat slope of a resume that never got laid off. The numbers smiled faintly, the fine print minded its manners. It was the kind of paper you could frame if you didn't know what frames are for. "SEC still quiet," the mentee said, returning with a face that had practiced adulthood all morning. I thanked her for the quiet as if it were a product. She laid 3 more statements on the blotter with care, like plates you didn't want to chip. I flipped the top 1-page flip, and my voicemail light chose that moment to wake. Blink, blink, pause, blink. The rhythm made a sentence I couldn't hear yet. I let it blink. If I answered now, I'd only be narrating the loop. Across the floor, someone said one more tranche out of habit and then coughed it back into their collar. We had trained our mouths to speak in arrivals. Now we were living in departures. I wrote one last line. 12:04. Called auditor again, voicemail, and put the pen down. The day narrowed to a still life, a stack of statements with their calm faces up, a voicemail light blinking insistence into the air, and my palms flat on the desk, listening for a counterparty that still hadn't said our name.
Chapter 7. Climax.
12:06. I let the voicemail play. Breath, a throat cleared. Then a voice I trust when rooms get small. "Call me back." I do. No answer. The light keeps blinking like a metronome that forgot the song. Printer. Dry whir. Page. Hush. Relay click. 12:09. The mentee stands in the doorway with an expression that wants instructions and mercy at once. 2 more redemptions. One says, "Today." She waits for a sentence I don't own. I give her a task instead. Order them by surgery and school, I say. She nods, grateful for triage. 12:11. A feeder principal texts a question without punctuation. Anything clearing. I type the only verb we've been able to conjugate. Processing. It feels like tap water where a fire is. 12:13. Margin clerk. We need positions or cash. He leaves the words on the desk like tools I don't have. I look at the statement slope, fine print, obedience and hate how well they pretend to be tools. 12:15. The phones adopt a new rhythm. Ring, hold, cut, ring, the way a person argues with themselves. I write the times because times feel like evidence. 12:15 donor asks for full exit. 12:16 hospital CFO wants partial. 12:17 family office says, all of it. Printer, were, page flip. 12:19. A number I don't recognize. I answer anyway. A voice that lives 2 doors closer to the center than I do. He told his lieutenant, I'm out of money. The sentence sits between us like a spill you can't mop, only watch spread. Say that again, I ask, as if repetition could make it untrue. Out of money. The clicks on the line sound like a counterparty code that never prints. 12:20. The capacity math I rehearsed in the dark comes back, the stadium seats we couldn't find, the volumes that never penciled. If there are no fills, there is nothing to unwind. No calls to buy back. No puts to sell to raise cash. No basket to tip into a bid that already hates itself. Just paper, just slope, just hush. Relay. Click, click. 12:22. I stand without meaning to. The room tilts by degrees only my stomach sees. Who else knows? I ask the voice. A few, it says, which is a number and a warning. He's been paying redemptions out of, you know. I do know, and I hear the room find a lower hum. 12:24. The mentee returns. Do we tell them anything new? She means the people who still believe schedule is substance. I want to say, tell them the street never learned our name. I say, tell them we're prioritizing operations, then payroll, then capital. It sounds like ethics, it's triage. 12:26. I dial the auditor again because faith repeats itself. Voicemail. I leave a message with nouns and no adjectives. Third party confirms. Today. Call me. I hang up and write the time so I can't lie to myself later. 12:28. The feeder calls. Is it just a squeeze? He asks, auditioning hope. I tell him a truth you can say out loud. Redemptions have outrun cash. He sighs like a person who wanted a smaller problem. He always finds a way, he says, then doesn't believe his own sentence. 12:31. My spouse again. Tuition? I type, wait one day. I watch the 3 words sit there like a small fence around a larger fall. 12:33. Another voice from the inner ring, tight as wire. He's sending checks, early. I picture envelopes as life preservers that won't float. I hear the click of a relay and imagine it's a door. 12:35. I pull a blank page and write what would save us if it could. Counterparty/DTCC/tickets. Under it, none. The letters look rude on company paper. 12:37. What do we do? The mentee asks. Her hands are steady. Mine are precise out of habit. We call, I say. We document. We do not promise. It is not courage. It is the only clean verb left. 12:39. The switchboard surges. A donor I've known for 15 years says, tell me the truth. I look at the statement's slope, at the checklist with its single struck line, at the empty place where a counterparty code should live. We're working through it, I say, and feel the sentence try to be kind. The printer breathes. Page flip. 12:41. The first internal email lands. Hold all new subscriptions. It reads like someone closing a window after the storm forgot the door. 12:43. I think of the 3 letters I wrote at 8:31 on a morning that pretended to be ordinary. SSC, not a strategy, a signal. I circle them again in my head and understand, with the clarity panic sometimes administers, that quiet was always the tell. 12:45. I called the voice back. Are we done? I ask, not finding a professional synonym for ending. Not yet, he says, and I can hear how near yet sits to now. The relay clicks once, like a metronome conceding tempo. The day leans forward. The minutes shorten. The story begins to speak in knocks. Evening pretended to be ordinary. Coats were taken, numbers handed. A quartet tuned itself into competence, while votives rehearsed their small bravery along the tables. The room had the surface of celebration linen that remembered starch, silver that remembered purpose, laughter that remembered its cue. He arrived the way reputations do, already in the room before the door knew it had opened, practiced warmth. Palms that knew where shoulders live, a smile with architecture. He lifted a glass, and the orchestra obeyed him without looking. To a resilient year, he said, smooth as a portfolio that never stutters. To prudence, to patience, to all of you. We raised ours because that's what rooms do. I felt the sentence way less than the stemware. Then the envelopes appeared quiet as place cards, thick as intent. A little early this time, he said, almost shy. A laugh moved across the floor like someone smoothing a dress. Early bonus checks holiday kindness. The story said liquidity. The subtext whispered. He shook hands with two staffers who had learned not to blink on cue. You've earned it, he told them, and the sentence performed solvency in front of witnesses. At the bar, the receipt printer let out a short, dry chirp, cousin to the one in our office. It startled me for no sensible reason. Somewhere near the service corridor a relay clicked building. Not metaphor, and I thought how even walls keep time. The checks passed like consecration, paper changing hands with ceremony, the ink fresher than anyone wanted to admit. I tried to picture the counterparty that would echo these numbers in the morning, and saw only a page looking back at itself. A donor gripped my elbow. One more tranche before year-end, can we still? The line arrived dressed for a party, as if the afternoon hadn't happened. I said, let's talk Monday, and watched the words put on a coat they didn't own. He nodded, relieved by a sentence that sounded like a calendar. We both looked away at the same time. He kept the room moving table to table, anecdote to anecdote, that gentle pat on the forearm that communicates both memory and mercy. Toasts were offered like receipts for an unbroken myth. He got us through the worst, someone said into a microphone, and the audience applauded their own good judgment. I thought about a checklist with a single line struck through and heard the applause land where third-party echoes should have been. Early this year, he repeated, palming another envelope with the ease of passing a roll at dinner. The stage lights made the paper look brave. A junior staffer mouthed thank you 3 times and blinked like a metronome. I tried not to do the math. How many redemptions dressed as generosity, how much paper required to perfume a room. Around dessert, the quartet found an old standard, and the room sang the chorus no one admits to knowing. He laughed at a joke that didn't ask for one. He posed with a family whose plaque bore his initials engraved like instruction. The camera flashed, soft pop, the sound of evidence being created without meaning. The checks kept moving. In the corridor I answered a call I shouldn't have taken. Any change? The feeder asked, his voice sanded down to diplomacy. I watched him across the room, phone lit like a votive inside his palm. Processing, I said, and heard the word audition for both prayer and lie. We ended together, the way people do when they don't want the line to remember them. Back inside, he told a story about weathering storms. The room leaned forward, grateful for familiar weather. I pictured the stadium seats that didn't exist, the fills that wouldn't print, the street that would not say our name back to us. I looked at the envelope on a busser's tray, addressed by hand, and felt how heavy paper can be when it replaces metal. He closed with grace notes, a scholarship saved, a wing finished ahead of schedule, a line about community that gave the crowd its own reflection back. The applause was warm and correct. We stood, we sat, we stood again for someone older than the room. The evening performed continuity until continuity believed it. On my way out, I passed a small table where unclaimed envelopes waited like coats whose owners had stepped outside for air. I almost reached out, as if weight could answer a question. The quartet packed without hurry. The relay clicked behind the service door, tick, tick, doing what machines do when people pretend time is a policy. He was 10 feet away, telling a joke that knew how to end. I watched the punchline land, perfectly, and felt the quiet that follows laughter, thin, exact like a blade drawn back into its handle. Morning wore yesterday's suit. The party's napkins were still in my coat pocket, folded into the kind of triangles you make when you need your hands to look busy. At 9:04 a text landed without hello. They're with him now. No names, just the pronoun that had done too much work for too many years. Printer, dry whir, page, hush, relay click. 9:11. Another message from the same number. Son's pressing, he says there's a plan. The word plan tried to put a roof back on the building. Across the floor, the mentee mouthed, anything? I lifted a hand the way you wave smoke away without admitting there's a fire. 9:17. The inner ring voice that never wasted syllables called. No preface. They asked him straight, he said. How much is left? What's real? How do we unwind? He inhaled and forgot to exhale. He said, there is no unwind. The room didn't change temperature. I did. 9:23. A pause wide enough to stand in. And 10, I asked, because sequence sometimes behaves like mercy. He said it, the voice answered. One big lie. The handset got heavier in my hand, as if sentences had weight when they finally admitted their size. Behind the wall, the relay clicked like a metronome, conceding it had been keeping time for the wrong song. 3 words, I thought, to answer 3 letters. SSC had been a fence I drew at 8:31 on an ordinary morning. One big lie was the gate being lifted, not by us, but by the only person who could pull it. 3 letters that asked for proof. 3 words that erased the need. 9:28. The mentee watched my face assemble itself. What do we tell them? She said. I looked down at a statement that still wore its calm like starch, and at the checklist with the struck-through line I could now read as prophecy. We tell them what we can verify, I said, and heard how small that left us. 9:31. A donor who preferred brevity called. So it's not just withdrawals. I stared at the slope that had always obliged us and understood, all at once, that it was stage dressing. It's not withdrawals, I said. It's origin. The line went quiet in the way people do when a word they thought was far away turns its head. 9:37. Another text, the kind that makes you respect the gravity in lowercase, told them in the apartment. That detail rearranged the map in my mind. No office, no conference room, no speakerphone that could pretend to be a process. A living room is where stories are told. A living room is where myths retire. 9:42. I wrote the words on the corner of my blotter because handwriting makes things real. 1 big lie. The letters crowded the page with a bluntness our packets never allowed. I boxed them once the way I'd circled SSC, and the symmetry felt less like style than indictment. We had always lived inside abbreviations, strategy initials, audit acronyms, regulator shorthand. 3 letters had been my private alarm. 3 words were the fire bell I could hear from down the hall. 9:49. The margin clerk from the other book pinged, positions. I typed, "We'll call," then didn't, because a call deserves a counterparty, and we had spent a decade raising our voices inside a room that insulated sound. 9:55. The feeder principle, voice shredded to thread. Is there anything to do? The old furniture wanted to answer for me. Slope, tranche, roll, but language was out of the building. Yes, I said. Stop saying processing. Start writing down who knew what, when. He didn't argue. He just hung up like a person obeying gravity. 10:03. I stood, and the room did not. People glanced at me the way you look at a weather report you've been avoiding. I told the mentee to start an internal log with an opening line that felt like the only honest sentence left. As of this minute, what we relied on to be true is a confession. 10:07. I thought of the morning I'd underlined SSC my hand, making a mark my mouth wouldn't, and felt the cheap justice of hindsight flirt with me. The numbers that kept us calm had been ink training us not to ask. Now 3 words had turned the ink to ash. The printer gave its dry liturgy whir, page, hush, as if paperwork could absolve stories. It could not. 10:12. Another text, he told them to call counsel. Of course he did. When a myth retires, it hires a lawyer. I wrote one more line under the box I'd drawn around 1 BIGLIE. Everything that can be proved must be proved by someone who doesn't love us. We did not make speeches, we made lists. Counterparties to ask, regulators to notify, donors to call in an order that honored surgery before ceremony. The day shortened its stride. Somewhere past the wall, the relay clicked, faithful and wrong. I put the cap on my pen with a finality that felt ceremonial and said to the room, "Tomorrow we'll knock." Morning decided for us. At 8:17, a group texted just 3 words, from a number that never wasted them, "On our way." The room didn't react. Rooms prefer nouns. Printer, dry whir, page, hush, relay, click. At 8:23, the mentee set a legal pad on my desk, her handwriting already narrower than yesterday's. "They're saying today," she said, and the word felt like an address. I nodded at nothing useful. 8:29. A final domestic detail from the inner ring. He's still in the apartment. We all looked at our screens as if they could teach us what to do with the living room. I turned a statement over so I wouldn't have to see it slope and reached for the margin when I'd fenced a thought months earlier. My pen hovered, then landed. SSC, 8:31. That was the timestamp I wrote beside it. Back then, I told myself the letters stood for the strategy split strike conversion habit, doing copy work for belief. Today, I let the letters say what my hand had meant the first time and my mouth refused. Street side confirm. 3 words that, if answered, would have forced the story to echo in a room that didn't love us. I underlined them once. The relay behind the wall clicked and, for the first time, sounded like a metronome kept for the wrong song. 8:33. I dialed a number I'd been saving for adulthood. DTCC Confirmations Human, not Portal the kind of desk, with a voice that can make you smaller by telling the truth. Ring, ring, ring. Voicemail, cheerful and wrong. Leave a message. I did, careful with nouns, stingy with adjectives. Account ending X, representative tickets for dates. I added my cell and wrote the time in the margin because time is what you have when you don't have proof. Call no one returned. 8:37. Another text, shorter yet. Upstairs. A door we all knew by lore, not by visit. Someone down the hall said, "It won't be public today," with the authority of a person rehearsing comfort. Printer, whir. Page flip, hush. The mentee stood in the doorway without stepping in, as if the carpet were braver than the room. "Do we start telling people?" she asked. "We start telling the truth we can verify," I said, listening to how small that sentence left us. 8:41. The inner ring voice again, now in present tense. They knocked. I pictured 2 agents in coats that knew their work, the apartment's echo deciding to participate. The voice didn't narrate footsteps or faces. It cut to the line that retires euphemism. He said, a breath. He said, "There is no innocent explanation. Silence has sizes." This one fit the building. The relay clicked for once. It didn't land anywhere. I wrote the sentence under SSC, in block letters, as if my hand were trying to take responsibility. My voice could not. No innocent explanation. The words sat on the paper like a verdict that had studied our stationery. 8:44. The mentee swallowed and found her work again. "Hospitals first?" she asked. "Hospitals," I said. "We started a list that pretended order is a kind of mercy. Surgery before ceremony, tuition before naming rights." A donor called without hello. "Say it plainly." I tried. The numbers were paperwork. I didn't say, "We never asked the street to remember us," because I still wanted the day to forgive something. 8:49. My phone lit with the auditor's number, as if the universe wanted to practice irony. It rang once and quit, like a thought that changed its mind. Call no one returned. The DTCC line sat in my recent calls with a single gray arrow, a small drawing of what due diligence looks like when it is late. 8:53. Another message, careful in lowercase, "He's with them." Past tense began renovating the room. The printer, idiotically faithful, delivered a final page with the slope we had used as a lullaby. I flipped it and pressed my palm to the back as if heat could turn paper into anything but paper. The margin note SSC shone through the sheet like a watermark, not strategy, not brand. The question I should have asked out loud when the room still liked me. 9:01. We drafted the email no one trained you to write. Subject line plain. 4 sentences, all verbs required to live somewhere the street could corroborate. No bravado, no shilule. Just the architecture of accountability. Who calls whom, in what order, with what questions. We will follow facts that others can verify, I typed, and meant the cruelty in it. 906. The inner ring voice once more. Now logistics, now law. They're taking him, he said, and I watched the sentence change the shape of the air. The mentee put her headset on the desk like a small ceremony. Across the floor, a colleague started to say one more tranche and stopped at the first word, the way you catch yourself using a nickname in a place it doesn't belong. 9:10. The switchboard, which had trained us to hear confidence as evidence, fell to its knees. Lights that had learned to rise in unison blinked once and surrendered. Phones went dead, not like power, like purpose. The relay behind the wall offered one last click and gave up its patience. In that sudden, exact quiet, I looked at the page I'd made. SSC? Underlined at 8:31, the line no innocent explanation, the arrow beside the DTCC call that would never come back. 3 letters I drew when it still would have mattered. 3 words that made sure it was too late. We sat in offices built for optimism and listened to silence do the work we should have done.
Chapter 8. Aftermath.
The day after, the silence changed species. It wasn't the careful, curated hush of an office pretending to be competent. It was the sound a building makes when purpose leaves chairs half pushed in, badge lights blinking at no one, phones that had forgotten their chorus. We learned a new choreography. Unlock, box, label, repeat. Statements that once arrived like blessings were now evidence. We slid them into bankers' boxes with the same tenderness you use to put away old photographs, aware that the images are about to be cross-examined. The printer-faithful trader sat mute. When it finally stirred, issuing one last dry whir, we pulled the paper and turned it over, as if blankness could absolve ink. The first collapse I witnessed wasn't ours, it was a foundation's. A conference room with old coffee and newer dread, a director reading a prepared statement to a staff that had built a career stitching steadiness to need. "We will suspend grants," she said, then softened the verb with the cushion of temporarily, the way you tuck a pillow under a fall. The pediatric program director checked the calendar like a person bargaining with time. A program officer, eyes red like she'd been grading loss, whispered, "We promised." When the meeting ended, nobody stood, they just let the room decide when to move them. Outside, a donor list sat on a printer tray, face down, as if privacy were a form of mercy. The second collapse was domestic. A retiree who still wore a watch that clicked real seconds sat at his kitchen table with his spouse and a stack of account letters, the newest one politely explaining how a lifetime had been misnamed. Their daughter called from a minivan. "Are you okay?" The answer they gave her would be a kind of truth for a while. Across town, a school bursar rolled her chair to the corner where the copier lives and printed out Plan B, then Plan C, then a polite notice about adjusted timelines that read like apology dressed as logistics. We had taught entire communities to budget the slope, now they were trying to budget the fall. Word travels in 3 languages: whisper, headline, notice. The whisper was worst neighbors who hadn't been touched, stepping backward from their advisors as if contagion were carried in business cards. People with no exposure opening bank apps 3 times before breakfast. A friend who sold at the bottom because he couldn't distinguish myth from market anymore. Headline came next. The promised reverence of columns and anchors that lean their certainty into the camera. Our story fed their certainty like coal. Notice was the email you write at 2:11 a.m., a beginning out of an abundance of caution, a phrase that tries to make fear sound like a policy. The contagion of distrust moved faster than the facts. It took host in places the crime had never visited. A community foundation that hadn't so much as shaken hands with the inner circle saw 3 anchor families withdraw, then 5 board members revisit risk, then a gala committee go from seating chart to cancellation notice in a single nervous week. A cautious endowment liquidated to deposits, then to insured deposits, as if adding adjectives to the word cash could anesthetize volatility. People who weren't victims pulled money from people who had never fooled them, because the line between gullibility and prudence is thin when you're counting on a mortgage clearing Tuesday. We mistook what was broken verification for who was broken everyone. Opportunity costs rarely cry, they just don't call back. Grants that would have hired nurses in March became emails that promised to reassess in Q4. A lab delayed trials and, with them, the tidy miracles that prefer to arrive on schedule. A small arts nonprofit closed with grace and a sign on the door that said thank you to a street that could not answer. A hospital that had planned to break ground swallowed its ambition and taped paper over the rendering in the lobby. We were all paying for a lie that had learned to impersonate calm, and the price wasn't just what left accounts, it was the work that never entered the world. I watched advisors I respect bleed clients who'd never read their statements before, watched prudent portfolios get dismantled because fear doesn't distinguish. The market, insulted and then opportunistic, did what it always does after it finishes a tantrum. It offered a rebound that required staying in the room. Many could not. They moved to the safety that sells best in the dark, cash with a halo, guarantees with an asterisk, and they missed the light by inches. In meetings that felt like triage, we tried to preach patience without sounding like salespeople, and when people chose exits, we documented without judgment. Because dignity is a kind of restitution you can pay immediately. Affinity cut both ways. The same networks that once certified belief now amplified doubt. Our synagogue board called an emergency session and, with exquisite manners, unspooled a decades-long tapestry of we know them into a checklist of we will verify. Country club chatter turned from access to audits. A school auction's funnier MC got serious for 1 minute and raised less money than anyone expected. In homes where statements had lived unexamined in desk drawers, people opened envelopes like they were diffusing something. I kept a new notebook. Not for slope or schedules, those words had retired, but for names of people whose lives would feel this the longest and for the promises we had left that could still be kept. If Act I was belief and Act Theremin too was rupture, Act 3 began here, in the ordinary labor of owning what happened and refusing to let ruin be the only plot. And then quietly, improbably, another story started to gather at the edges. Not forgiveness, never that, but a reckoning that would move money back toward the people who had once been told to sleep. The reckoning did not arrive as absolution, it arrived as mail. First came the SEPA letters, careful, lawyered sentences that began to unspool the map from theft back to principle. The trustee's office spoke a blunt dialect of fairness. If you had pulled out more than you ever put in, you were asked to return the excess. If you had been net negative, most of us were, you would be made whole to the extent the law and recovered dollars allowed. Clawback sounded predatory until you sat with the arithmetic, then it sounded like the only way to bend the math toward equity. I watched people who'd once toasted access write checks to a pool they would never see again, and I watched people who'd been quiet about their losses open envelopes that returned something sturdier than sympathy. The other stream had a different seal and a different cadence. The Department of Justice Fund drew from forfeitures and settlements the long, unsentimental work of turning names, accounts, and seized assets into checks. Where the trustees' letters were ledger and statute, the DOJ's notices read like a government promising to remember you. Waves went out first, second, then more, each a step in an exhausting choreography of forms, proofs, and the small indignities of declaring once again who you are and what, exactly, was taken from you. People learned a new vocabulary: net equity, allowed claim, distribution percentage. The words were unsentimental. The day an envelope landed was not. The first time I sat at a kitchen table while one of those checks was opened, the room behaved like a body exhaling. A widow in a cardigan that had outlived 2 winters slid a butter knife under the flap with ceremony and no flourish. She didn't cry. She did the math the way you count pills for the week. Calm, precise, practical. It won't replace him, she said, meaning her husband, and then, without saying it, the years they had planned to purchase with ordinary safety. But it will replace the roof. We drank coffee that had gone cool while she called her daughter to say, simply, it came. SEPA credits felt different. Institutions received letters that repaired ledgers, if not reputations. A clinic director emailed me 2 words credited principal, and then a list of patients their budget could hold again. A scholarship committee which had built a whole year on will reassess. Reassessed into yes. No fictitious profits were recognized in any of it. Those evaporated with the confession, but principle found its way back across the map, not as a victory lap, but as a corrective. The math was unromantic and therefore trustworthy. It said, you put X in, we have found Y here is Y less the friction the search required. Not everything about recovery felt clean. Clawbacks hurt people who had left early for reasons that had nothing to do with foresight. Lawsuits reached into quiet lives to reclaim money that had been spent on college, on a parent's care, on the same ordinary hopes we were all trying to fund. We learned, again, that fairness and forgiveness are cousins who don't always visit together. And yet, when you step back from the bitterness of individual cases, you see the scale. Tens of thousands across ZIP codes and continents, pulled back toward level ground by two systems that rarely get to be heroes. The number was not around 100, but it pressed close enough to deserve the phrase vast majority. In a world that had learned to distrust superlatives, that one earned its right to speak. An odd grace lived in the paperwork. The trustees' letters arrived on heavier stock, the kind of paper that takes ink without bleeding, and the DOJ checks tore free from their perforations with a sound like a page deciding to be useful. Those small tactile mercies mattered. They said, "This is not theater. This is not a slope that flatters. This is money that has walked around the world and found your mailbox." A foundation that had frozen its grants unthawed them in cautious increments, first staff, then programs sticking loyalty back together with receipts. A retiree who thought he would never forgive the word distribution used it again, carefully, to describe a payment from the government, not from a myth. It paid back the money it couldn't pay back the time. Page flip. The printer in our office repurposed now for audits that ask the street to say our name back gives its dry assent. If Act I was belief and Act 2 was rupture, this is not Act 3 redemption, it is restitution, a colder, truer word. The checks did not make donors less embarrassed or boards less chastened. They did not return the years of compound learning a charity missed, or hand back to a widow the mornings that were supposed to be ordinary. But they did buy oxygen, roofs held, programs restarted, tuitions cleared. In the ledger of harm, that matters. I keep one of those stubs in a file labeled proof. Not because I worship paper anymore, but because paper, when it points outward and echoes back, can be a kind of justice. We didn't get our innocence back. We got our principle back, mostly, and a mandate to live differently under it. The grace note isn't forgiveness. It's the decision to build again with questions, with counterparty codes, with calls that get returned, and to let the future be funded by facts, not faith alone. The relay clicks. The room exhales. We keep the receipts now.
Epilogue.
I used to think safety was a feeling and ambiance you could set with smooth charts and familiar names. Now I measure safety in echoes. If a number doesn't answer back from a place that doesn't love me, it's only scenery. After the arrests and the boxes and the statements demoted to evidence, I didn't become brave so much as practical. I ask for fills without apology. I ask the street to remember us. If a process has a person in the middle, I ask who can overrule them and who can't. I don't confuse privacy with prudence or smallness with virtue or reputation with proof. I still like boring. I've just learned that boring has a backbone, timestamps, counterparty codes, reconciliations that rhyme on two ledgers at once. People ask what changed in me. Less faith in smoothness, more loyalty to friction. Meetings run longer. Some invitations don't arrive anymore. That's fine. The only doors I want to walk through are the ones that open after a question lands. I am gentler with the young when they sound impolite, because doubt is how stewardship begins. I am less dazzled by the rooms that glow and more devoted to the rooms that keep receipts. When a donor asks for speed, I offer sequence. When a colleague says, "They've been through there," I say, "Who called whom?" I keep the circle I drew at 8:31 in a clear sleeve not as penance, but as a tool. It's a reminder that habits can be questions disguised as ink, and that silence has sizes, and that the smallest mark can be the hinge of a life. If you want my lesson in one line, it's this. Trust is not an asset class, verification is.
In the world we have just crossed, social proof outvoted facts, and complexity dressed itself as care. A gala card stood in for a question. An audit letterhead stood in for a call. 3 letters in a margin, S, S, C, stood in for the echo we never demanded. Each artifact was paper speaking to paper, a chorus that never asked the room next door to answer back. We believed the performance because it was polite, because it was boring, because it arrived on time. But trust without verification is only staging, and staging collapses the first time someone opens a door that leads outside. What we owe the people who sat at those tables and those desks is not eloquence. It is procedure. If a number cannot be repeated by a stranger, it is a story. If an audit cannot name a counterparty, it is a costume. If a regulator will not pick up the phone, we will. The guardrails are simple and non-negotiable. Call the clearinghouse. Ask the counterparty to read you back your own trade. Insist on blue sheet echoes. Write down times, titles, and who can overrule whom. Treat small firms with respect and large reputations with distance. Replace examined with confirmed. We will not confuse privacy with prudence, or scarcity with proof, or paperwork with memory. Listen to the room now. Breath steadied, HVAC low. The printer's dry whir beginning not as applause but as a prompt. Page flip, not to end the inquiry, but to turn it. A relay click that no longer dismisses doubt but cues the next call. The sonic motif remains, repurposed. Machines that once blessed smoothness now mark the beats of verification. We will honor the losses by refusing to outsource our duties to aura or access. We will be courteous, and we will be exact. We will ask out loud what a margin note tried to ask for us. The page settles. The relay clicks. And we keep the receipts now.